I was served with a lawsuit for building a dock on my own property. That might sound like a standard, albeit annoying, neighborhood dispute, but it was far more absurd. The lawsuit wasn't just for a dock on my land. It was for a dock on a lakefront that I happened to own in its entirety, the water, the land beneath it, and a tidy buffer around the whole shoreline. The woman suing me, a newcomer named Carol, was about to get a very expensive education in the fine art of property law, and I was, unexpectedly, going to be her professor. My name is Arthur, and I'm a retired geomatics engineer. That's a fancy term for someone who spent 40 years dealing with land surveying, cartography, and the complex geometry of legal boundaries. I live and breathe maps, deeds, and property records. When I retired, I wanted one thing: absolute, uninterrupted peace. So I spent a significant portion of my life savings on a unique parcel of land, a huge tract of forest that completely encircled a small, pristine lake. It was my private paradise. Carol bought the one house on the adjacent road whose backyard came closest to the water, separated from the lake itself by a 30-foot wide strip of my woods. She seemed to believe that proximity equaled ownership. It started with a note taped to my dock, written in aggressive red marker, about my unauthorized construction. I ignored it. Then came the cease and desist letter from a lawyer, which was almost comical in its inaccuracy. But what Carol and her cut-rate attorney didn't know was that they weren't just picking a fight with a quiet retiree who liked to fish. They were legally challenging a man whose entire career was built on the very concept of irrefutable, unchangeable boundaries. Have you ever encountered someone so confident in their own ignorance that they were willing to bet their life savings on it? Stick around, because this isn't just a story about a dock dispute. It's a detailed blueprint for how to dismantle baseless arrogance with a mountain of cold, hard, historical fact. My first instinct, despite the aggressive legal letter, was to de-escalate. I'm a man who values tranquility. Courtrooms are the antithesis of that. I walked over to Carol's house one afternoon, carrying a rolled-up copy of the official county plat map. She was in her yard, supervising a gardener with an air of regal authority. When she saw me approaching, her expression soured, as if I were a particularly unpleasant odor that had just drifted in. I tried to be neighborly. "Hello, Carol. I'm Arthur from next door. I believe there's been a misunderstanding about the new dock." I unrolled the map on her patio table, pointing to the thick, clear line that delineated my property. I showed her how my parcel, Lot A, encompassed the entire lake and the shoreline. I then pointed to her much smaller lot, Lot F, showing how it clearly stopped 30 feet short of my property line. Her response was a dismissive wave of her hand. "Those online maps are never right," she scoffed. My real estate agent was very clear. "This is a lakefront property. I have lake rights." It's common sense. I tried to explain that real estate agents sometimes engage in puffery and that the legal deed is what matters, but she cut me off. "I'm not going to be lectured by some developer who's trying to wall off the community's lake," she snapped, her voice rising. It was at that moment I realized reason was not on the menu. The situation escalated rapidly from there. She began a one-woman crusade against me. She told the other half-dozen homeowners on the road that I was an arrogant millionaire trying to privatize a public lake, conveniently omitting that it had always been private. She started a social media group titled Save Vance Lake, casting herself as the heroic activist. The final straw was when a process server, looking deeply apologetic, handed me the official summons. The lawsuit was a work of fiction, accusing me of violating non-existent homeowner association covenants, causing environmental damage by building a simple wooden dock, and intentionally diminishing her property value. It was a declaration of war, and I knew then that my peaceful, quiet resolution was no longer an option. She had chosen the battlefield, and unfortunately for her, it was a field where I was the undisputed master. The lawsuit, while infuriating, was also a catalyst. It awoke the old professional instincts I thought I'd left behind in my quiet retirement. This was no longer just about my dock. It was about the sanctity of the record, the purity of the data. Carol and her lawyer were attacking the very foundation of my life's work. So, I went to work. I wasn't just going to defend myself. I was going to build a case so airtight, so overwhelmingly definitive, that it would be a monument to her foolishness. I started in my home office, which is less a retiree's hobby room and more a professional cartographer's command center. I pulled up the modern GIS data from the county, of course. That was the easy part. But I knew that the real truth, the unassailable proof, lay buried in the past. I drove to the county records office and spent a day poring over dusty deed books and original plat maps from the late 1800s. The clerk, a helpful woman named Marge, gave me access to the archives. There, I found it. The original 1887 survey of the township. The lines, drawn in faded but still precise ink, told the whole story. I scanned them all in high resolution. Then I went further, pulling the entire chain of title for my parcel. I traced its ownership from the original railroad grant all the way to me. And that's when I found the first piece of gold. The 1923 sale of the land to a wealthy timber baron, Thaddeus Vance, a distant and forgotten great-uncle of mine, coincidentally, included a very specific legal description. It didn't just grant him the land around the lake. The deed explicitly conveyed all lands comprising the bed, banks, and waters of the body of water known colloquially as Mirror Lake, to be henceforth known as Vance Lake. He had bought the lake itself. But the true aha moment, the discovery that made me laugh out loud in the quiet archives, was a detail from a 1952 subdivision plan when the land around my central parcel was sold off to create the lots where Carol's house now stood. The surveyors, at my great-uncle's insistence, had included a 1-foot reservation strip or spite strip that ran along the entire outer boundary of his property. This tiny, 1-foot-wide ribbon of land that I now owned was a deliberate and legally flawless barrier, created for the express purpose of preventing any of the adjacent lots from ever claiming lakefront access or rights. Carol wasn't just 30 feet from the lake. She was 30 feet plus 1, legally insurmountable foot. With my arsenal of historical maps, deeds, and surveys, I knew I had more than enough to get the case dismissed. But a simple dismissal felt insufficient. Carol hadn't just made a mistake. She had engaged in a malicious campaign to slander my name and drag me through an expensive legal process out of sheer entitlement. I wanted more than a win. I wanted a definitive, permanent, and financially painful end to her crusade. This required a legal strategy, which meant I needed a proper lawyer. I didn't go to a big, stuffy firm. I found a young, hungry litigator named Ben Carter whose small practice specialized in real estate disputes. When I laid out my files on his conference table, the high-resolution scans of the 1887 survey, the 1923 deed conveying the lake bed, the 1952 plat map with the highlighted 1-foot reservation strip, Ben's eyes lit up. He leaned back in his chair, a slow grin spreading across his face. "Mr. Vance," he said, "this isn't a case. This is a public execution." That's when I knew I'd found my guy. Our plan was simple but brutal. First, we would file a standard response to her lawsuit, denying all her claims but keeping our powder dry. We wouldn't reveal the full, crushing weight of our evidence in the initial filings. Let her lawyer, who was clearly operating on a contingency fee or a shoestring budget, continue to spin his wheels and run up billable hours on a fantasy case. The second phase of the plan was a counteroffensive. We would file a counterclaim against Carol. It would be for 3 things. First, to recover every penny of my legal fees under the state's frivolous litigation statute. Second, for slander, using her social media posts and recorded statements from neighbors as proof. And third, and most importantly, we would file for a quiet title action. This is a powerful legal tool that asks the court to declare, with absolute finality, my ownership of the lake and the reservation strip, effectively extinguishing any cloud on the title and preventing Carol or any other neighbor from ever attempting such a stunt again. It would be a permanent judicial seal on my rights. My evidence would be the centerpiece of the quiet title action, transforming it from a simple defense into an offensive strike that would settle the matter for all time. While Ben and I were methodically building our legal fortress, Carol was constructing a castle in the sky. Her initial surge of local support, fueled by her misleading narrative, had completely gone to her head. My simple, factual legal denial, stripped of any angry rhetoric, she interpreted as weakness. To her, it was a sign that I had nothing, that I was scrambling. Her arrogance swelled to magnificent proportions. She held community meetings on the patch of grass at the end of the public road, just feet from my property line. I could see them from my living room window. She would stand on a cooler, gesturing wildly towards my dock, performing for a small but rapt audience of a few other neighbors she'd managed to whip into a frenzy. She was the brave underdog, the Aaron Brockovich of the cul-de-sac. The local news station, always hungry for a David versus Goliath story, took the bait. They ran a short, fluff piece featuring Carol looking concerned, pointing at my dock while the reporter spoke in grave tones about a wealthy landowner restricting access to a beloved community lake. They never contacted me for comment. The footage showed her standing with her supporters, signs in hand, looking like a noble resistance movement. This public spectacle was infuriating, but Ben advised me to let it happen. Every unsubstantiated claim, every public statement, is another nail for her coffin, he'd said over the phone. Just keep a record, so I did. I saved screenshots of her social media posts. I had a friend record the news segment. Carol believed she was winning the court of public opinion, but the only court that mattered was the one where opinion is irrelevant and evidence is king. Her overconfidence was making our job easier. She was so busy playing the victim for the cameras that she and her lawyer were completely oblivious to the archival tsunami that was about to wash their case, and her credibility away for good. She was walking toward the edge of a cliff, convinced she was about to be crowned queen of the mountain. The legal dance began. Her lawyer, a man named Henderson, initiated the discovery process. We received a list of interrogatories, formal written questions we were required to answer under oath. They were boilerplate, a fishing expedition. State the basis for your claim to the property on which the dock is constructed. Identify all persons who assisted in the construction of the dock. Henderson was clearly expecting a fight over interpretation, a battle of conflicting surveys. He was playing checkers, while we were preparing to unveil a three-dimensional chessboard. Under Ben's guidance, our answers were meticulously truthful but strategically minimal. To the question about the basis of my ownership, we simply wrote, fee simple ownership of the parcel legally described in County Record Book 123, page 45, the chain of title for which is unbroken since the original patent. We gave him the reference number, the breadcrumb. We knew he was too lazy or too cheap to follow it properly. The process moved, as these things do, at a glacial pace. Eventually, the judge, seeing a dispute between neighbors, ordered us into mandatory mediation. I dreaded it. It meant sitting in a room with Carol. Ben assured me it was a necessary step we had to endure before we could get to the main event. The mediation was held in a sterile conference room with a professional mediator. Carol arrived with Henderson, looking supremely confident, as if she were there to accept my surrender. She opened with an offer that was breathtaking in its audacity. She would graciously allow me to keep my illegal dock, but only if I signed a permanent, binding easement granting her and all her fellow community members unrestricted access to the lake via a 20-foot wide path on my property, which was to include a new boat launch and a designated swimming area. She presented it as a generous compromise. Ben just listened patiently. When she was finished, he calmly replied, Mr. Vance respectfully declines that offer. Our position is that there is nothing to negotiate. Carol's face flushed with anger. Her lawyer, Henderson, adopted a patronizing tone. You should reconsider, he warned Ben. A judge will not look kindly on your client's unwillingness to find a reasonable middle ground. The arrogance was palpable. They thought our refusal was a bluff. The mediation failed, just as we knew it would. As we left, Carol shot a parting barb. See you in court. I'm going to own that lake. It was the last confident thing I would ever hear her say. The failure of mediation was the final procedural gate we had to pass through. Now, the path was clear for our primary strategic objective, a motion for summary judgment. In the legal world, this is a request for the judge to rule on the case without a full trial, on the grounds that the undisputed facts are so overwhelmingly in your favor that the other side cannot possibly win. It's a knockout punch, and we had spent months preparing it. Ben drafted the motion, a masterpiece of concise legal argument. It laid out the basic facts and referenced our counterclaim for quiet title. We attached the modern county map and the deed to my property. But the crown jewels, the certified 1887 survey, the 1923 deed to the lake bed, the 1952 plat map with the spite strip, and my sworn affidavit as a geomatics expert explaining their significance were held back. We listed them as exhibits to be presented at the hearing itself. It was a calculated move. We wanted to see the look on their faces in the courtroom when the full picture was revealed. Henderson and Carroll would receive the motion and see a confident, but, in their eyes, unsubstantiated claim. They would assume our evidence was weak or open to interpretation. They were still stuck in their narrative of a simple boundary dispute, a he said, she said, over where a line should be. They had absolutely no comprehension of the historical and legal reality, that I didn't just own the property line, I owned the entire geographic feature at the center of the dispute. The hearing was scheduled. In the weeks leading up to it, Carroll's social media posts became more triumphant. Big day in court coming up. Justice for our community, Lake, is at hand, she wrote. She was rallying her troops for a victory parade, completely unaware that she was marching them straight into a perfectly executed ambush. Ben and I did a final review the day before the hearing. Every document was certified, every map authenticated. Our presentation was loaded onto a thumb drive, ready to be displayed on the courtroom monitors. Are you ready, Arthur? Ben asked. I'm not the one who needs to be, I replied, feeling a calm, cold certainty settle over me. The time for talking was over. The facts were about to speak for themselves. The day of the summary judgment hearing arrived. I wore a simple suit, a stark contrast to my usual flannel shirts. Ben was already at the plaintiff's table, looking calm and organized. Carroll swept in a few minutes later with her lawyer, Henderson. She was dressed in a bright pink power suit, a conqueror arriving to claim her spoils. She shot me a look of pure, triumphant disdain. The judge, a stern-faced woman named Judge Miller, called the court to order. Henderson went first. He launched into a passionate, if factually barren, speech about community, fairness, and the public trust. He painted me as a greedy, reclusive tycoon trying to steal a natural resource from hard-working families. He gestured toward Carroll, who did her best to look like a beleaguered saint. It was pure theater, and Judge Miller seemed unimpressed, tapping her pen impatiently. Then, it was our turn. Ben stood up, calm and methodical. Your Honor, he began. We are here today because the plaintiff has built a case upon a foundation of assumption, misinformation, and what appears to be a complete lack of basic due diligence. This is not a boundary dispute. He clicked the first slide onto the large monitors positioned around the courtroom. It was the current county GIS map. This is the plaintiff's understanding of the situation, he said. He then clicked again, and a new layer faded in over the map, the crisp, black and white lines of the certified 1887 survey. And this is the reality. He proceeded to walk the judge through the history of the land, slide by slide. He showed the 1923 deed, with the language bed, banks, and waters of Vance Lake, highlighted in yellow. A low murmur went through the small public gallery. He then brought up the 1952 subdivision plat. And this, Your Honor, is the nail in the coffin. He zoomed in on the boundary between my property and Carroll's. A thin, red line appeared. This is a 1-foot reservation strip, a legal buffer, that surrounds the entirety of Mr. Vance's property. The plaintiff has never, at any point, owned lakefront property. In fact, she legally cannot even set foot on the shoreline without trespassing, he concluded by showing the slander evidence. The news clip, the social media posts. The trap was sprung. The atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted from bored procedure to stunned silence. Carroll's smug expression had dissolved, replaced by a mask of slack-jawed confusion. She was frantically whispering to Henderson, jabbing a finger at the screen. Henderson himself looked like he'd been poleaxed. His face was pale, and he shuffled through his thin folder of papers with a growing sense of panic. It was clear he was seeing this evidence for the very first time. He had taken his client at her word and hadn't bothered to do a thorough title search, one of the most fundamental tasks in property law. Judge Miller leaned forward, peering over her glasses first at the screen, then at the mortified lawyer. Mr. Henderson, she said, her voice dangerously quiet. Is this the first time you are seeing these historical plats and deeds? Henderson stammered. Your Honor, we believe the county's modern map was the controlling document. The judge's expression hardened. The controlling document is the legally recorded chain of title. Did you or did you not perform a complete title search on the defendant's parcel before filing this lawsuit? The silence that followed was thick and agonizing. We relied on our client's representations and the information from the seller's agent, he mumbled, effectively throwing both himself and his client under the bus. Judge Miller leaned back, her disgust evident. I see. She looked at Carol, then back at Henderson. The motion for summary judgment is granted. The plaintiff's case is dismissed with prejudice. She slammed her gavel lightly. But she wasn't done. Furthermore, she continued, looking at our counterclaim documents, the court finds that this lawsuit was frivolous, without merit, and brought for the purposes of harassment. I am granting the defendant's motion to quiet title in its entirety. Mr. Vance's ownership of Vance Lake and its surrounding reservation lands is hereby affirmed. I am also awarding the defendant full recovery of all legal fees and costs from the plaintiff. Carol let out a small gasp. Her public crusade had just ended in utter, complete, and very expensive humiliation. The aftermath was swift and brutal for Carol. The judgment wasn't just a loss. It was a financial anchor chained to her leg. Ben filed the paperwork immediately, placing a lien against her property for the full amount of my legal fees, which were substantial. She couldn't sell her house, refinance it, or do anything without paying me first. The news of her public drubbing and the court's official declaration of my ownership spread quickly. The local news station, embarrassed by their one-sided story, had to issue a formal on-air correction, clarifying that Vance Lake was, and always had been, private property. Within a month, a for sale sign appeared in Carol's front yard. But selling a house with a 5-figure lien attached and a notorious reputation for litigiousness proved difficult. Her reign as the self-appointed queen of the neighborhood was over. The very neighbors she had rallied to her cause now avoided her gaze. Some even approached me quietly to apologize, admitting they had been swept up in her narrative without knowing the facts. My victory wasn't just personal, it had a broader, positive impact. The quiet title action was a matter of public record, providing permanent legal clarity for the entire area. There would be no more misunderstandings about who owned the lake. My tranquility was no longer just protected by a fence, but by a final, unassailable court order. Looking back, I never wanted this fight. I bought my land to escape conflict, not to engage in it. But the situation forced me to use the skills I had spent a lifetime honing. It reinforced a lesson I've always known to be true. Knowledge isn't just power, it's a shield. Diligence is the ultimate defense against the assaults of arrogance and ignorance. The moral of this story is simple. Before you decide to sue someone, before you rally a mob, before you declare war based on common sense, or what you feel should be true, do your homework. Check the facts, because you never know. The quiet old man you decide to bully might just be the one person on earth who can prove, down to the last millimeter and back to the 19th century, just how wrong you are. What's the most satisfying case of an entitled person getting their comeuppance that you've ever witnessed? I'd love to read about it in the comments.